So, good evening, everybody. We're approaching one of our highlights. 40 years ago, a small group of people started to think it would be a good idea to meet, have research conferences. They had a little money, they were involved with government, but I think they had absolutely no anticipation or clue that 40 years later, that organization would still be around and would still be alive and thriving. But it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce to you today a number of people, John actually will introduce them to you in a moment, who remember the first days and how it all started and have a lot of serious information on how it evolved, maybe some war stories from along the way too. But before I hand it over to John, it's our great pleasure tonight to welcome Dr. Margaret Whitehead, who is the widow of the late Tom Whitehead, who was very instrumental in getting TPRC going in the early days, and Dale will say more about it, and others probably too. So welcome here. We're so glad that you could join us tonight. John?
Thanks very much, Johannes. If I could ask our distinguished panelists to come up, we have Donna Lampert, Ellie Noem, Bruce Owen, Bill Melody, Dale Hatfield, Marjorie Blumenthal, and Jorge Chiments. What we want to do in this discussion is not only learn something about the origins of TPRC, but think about how TPRC has contributed to the policy debate over the years, talk about issues that have come and gone and come back again, or perhaps never really gone away. Convergence is finally here. And we also want to think about how TPRC can, in the future, contribute more fully to the policy debate. So what I've asked the panelists to do, just to get the flow of the conversation going, is to have each person just spend a few minutes reflecting on TPRC and TPRC's impact. What I'd like to do is start with Ellie Noem, in part because Ellie has done some digging in his inimitable fashion into some of the political and policy origins of the creation of the Office of Technology Policy in the White House many years ago, and subsequently TPRC. So I'm going to start with Ellie for a few minutes. Ellie may tell some stories and go on for a few minutes. Then we're going to get everybody else involved, and Ellie has promised to yield back the balance of his future time as we go forth. So Ellie, over to you.
It's nice to be back another night. You may become tired of me, but at least there's less of me now by design. So things in an event celebrating 40 years tend to get a little self-congratulatory, and rightly so. But so let me try to start out by being a party pooper. There's policy and there's politics. And the main narrative of TPRC is the policy one. There was monopolistic darkness, and then came TPRC and shone light and wisdom, and there came openness. But there's also the politics story of the origin of our organization, and it needs to be told, and I do apologize a little to Bruce and to Margaret Whitehead and to Dale, and to Margaret, to his late husband, Clay, Tom Whitehead. I had the privilege of knowing, and I truly admire as a pioneer in several fields. We all miss him greatly. He got this started. And perhaps they can also add some details. The story is a bit of a triangle, a Bermuda Triangle of academia and policy, but also politics. Let's start with the observation that TPRC was created by the Nixon White House. It was funded by the Nixon White House. Its first program was held in the Nixon White House Executive Office Building. Its program was set by the Nixon White House. It included administration officials from various agencies, plus selectively invited academics. They were chosen, I quote Bruce Owen, reprinted also in Sandra Brayman's book, and he wrote, quote, earlier expenditures of our budget had sometimes produced embarrassing results, such as studies whose conclusions were at odds with OTP's position. Clearly, this was not going to happen at the first conference. The part of the White House that started TPRC was the brand new Office of Telecommunications Policy, OTP. We need to understand the times and the context. These were the years of Vietnam and street demonstration, the ouster of President Johnson, the assassinations of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, the Chicago Convention. The Nixon administration had squeaked into office, felt mistreated by the press and TV networks, and there were probably, to some extent, they were. The administration then did several things in communications. First, using the newest communications technology, they bugged the Democratic chairman. Secondly, it appointed as chairman of the FCC a very political person, Dean Burge, a very good person, but very political person. He had been Barry Goldwater's right-wing campaign manager, and then the chairman of the Republican Party. The former chairman of the Republican Party ran the independent regulatory agency, FCC. A few months later, he requested the networks to provide transcripts of their on-air network reporters' comments following a presidential address. And there was a clear signal and a clear message. Third, the administration created in the White House the Office of Telecommunications Policy. By itself, this was a good idea, though it should be noted that this was never repeated again by any other administration, so maybe it wasn't such a great idea after all. But the OTP also was a bully pulpit, not only a think tank, which it was admirably, but it was also bully pulpit. Bully pulpit in two directions. First, internally within the administration against troglodytes in other agencies and departments who protected AT&T and Western Union and the Pony Express and so on. And that is Tom Whitehead's great contribution. He had an excellent team with him, including Antonin Scalia, who went on to other things, Bruce Owen, Dale Hatfield, Brian Lamb, and a number of luminaries. OTP was a think tank of brilliant people, but it wasn't only a think tank. To play an internal role and have clout, Tom also had to play along in the second role of OTP, namely to put pressure on critical media. Remember again the context. Vice President Spiro Agnew gave really tough speeches about mainstream press and its nattering nabobs of negativism, and the administration brought an antitrust action against the three networks. Attorney General John Mitchell told reporter Carl Bernstein about his boss, Katharine Graham, chairman of the Washington Post company. Katie Graham is going to get her tit caught in a big fat ringer if that is published. Okay, just so that the Democrats here don't get too complacent about this bit of sexism, the Democratic candidate, George McGovern, was reported to have responded privately, given Graham's physique, this was unlikely. And what was the ringer? What was the ringer for the various body parts, male and female? The licensing process. And sure enough, the TV licenses of the Washington Post Newsweek company were challenged. Later, Tom Whitehead said, forthrightly, honorably, the White House was vociferously denying that they had any role in this challenge. They were lying. Now, when OTP was created, the White House press secretary, Ron Ziegler, that Ron Ziegler who later became famous for saying about the Watergate, all of our previous statements are inoperative. Ron Ziegler said that the, quote, new office would not be concerned with the content of broadcasting and that its creation had no connection with Vice President Agnew's recent criticism of the communications media. But that statement, too, was inoperative. as we now know, because we have the memos and we have the kind of transcripts and so on and so forth. And there were people already, such as Les Brown, noted media journalist in the New York Times, who wrote about this. So the first bête noire was public broadcasting. We now have the transcripts of the White House tapes in which we hear the President of the United States fulminate against public broadcasting, especially the appointment of two broadcasters, newscasters, Robert McNeil and Sander Winokur. If anything, Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Colson felt even stronger. So what then was a 34-year-old staffer to do? If he wanted to pursue his pro-competition agenda on the telecom side, he needed clout, and for that he needed to be a team player. So we can sympathize with Tom as he entered, in my view, a Faustian bargain. That to get telecom competition, he had to go easy on the First Amendment and to join in the administration's pressure on media. And this happened as OTP, our progenitor, demanded that public broadcasters decentralize. In other words, no fourth national network, a public network. More independence for local station, no public affairs program. Get rid of McNeil and Winokur. And Whitehead wrote a memo to the president in 1971, to the president. We stand to gain substantially from an increase in the relative power of local stations. They are generally less liberal and more concerned with education than with controversial national affairs. Further, a decentralized system would have far less influence and be far less attentive to social activists. Now, on first blush, this doesn't sound good, but one must understand what Whitehead is trying to do. He's trying to broker a deal and must appeal to Nixon's darker instincts. Because, and there was a deal. In return, the broadcasters, public broadcasters were to receive more money, a 5-year budget, and so on and so forth. And then, in the last moment, so hard with these circumstances, Nixon literally reneged on the deal after the public broadcasters accepted it. He just didn't want any compromise at all. So now, so it must have been really hard. Now, Whitehead, when it comes to commercial networks, Whitehead gave a speech in Indianapolis in which he criticized the network news for ideological plagola, elite gossip, and biased reporting. And that's probably basically correct. But he also then followed up by saying station managers and network managers, officials who fail to act to correct imbalance and consistent bias from the network or acquiesce by silence can only be considered willing participant to be held fully accountable by the community at license renewal time. There was certainly got attention. Okay, let me kind of shorten this a little bit here. So these were the circumstances in which OTP was conceived and OTP created TPRC. Whitehead himself said that, quote, no one who is realistic about how government works would expect that an agency could exist in the executive branch, answerable directly to the president, that would not be political in some sense. And it would be equally unrealistic to expect that this first conference 40 years ago would not have been equally politically conceived in some sense. So therefore, like it or not, we were created to some extent as a tool. Better policy was the purpose, but not the only purpose. And the first academics, 15 academics, 13 of whom were economists, who were invited, were in some way also tool in a much bigger game, whether they realized it or not. But what I find remarkable about the TPRC community is how it transcended this origin, becoming a professional, independent, screw politics, screw lobbyists, whatever, publishable research organizations. There are duplicators around the world, but there's nothing like it. And that resilience is what we should celebrate here because it assures our future.
Thank you very much for those stage-setting remarks. I think it might be appropriate to start with over here with Dale and maybe
Bruce
Bruce?
would be better just because Bruce was there in the actual formation, and I was a pretty junior guy at the time.
Well, why don't we give Bruce the microphone and give Bruce the opportunity to make some remarks for a few minutes. We're going to try to get everybody involved real soon, but Bruce, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. I was a Brookings Economic Policy Fellow at OTP for the first year I was there, and then Tom asked me to stay for a second year, and I functioned as the chief economist. I was pretty much separated from anything that may have been political. In particular, public broadcasting was a subject that I had nothing to do with. I was trying to sell the spectrum, or to get Tom to tell the FCC to sell the spectrum. I was trying to get Tom to tell the FCC to deregulate radio stations, something the FCC actually eventually did. I wanted to break up AT&T, and Tom eventually, with heart in mouth, I'm sure, let me go over and talk to the Justice Department about that. I opposed the lawsuit against the broadcast networks, and I was allowed to go tell the Justice Department those things. In other words, my relationship in the office was purely with what I took from an academic point of view to be good policy. And I was always astonished when the FCC didn't do what seemed to me to be obviously the right thing. And I came to the conclusion that the only possible reason for this was that the FCC was poorly informed about the state of economic and other research on communications policy issues. It was that, together with an embarrassing unspent sum of money in the research budget, which was in some danger of being taken away from us if we didn't find a way to spend it, that led us to conceive of the first policy conference. As far as I can remember, and this is 40 years ago and memories are fallible, mine more than most, I think I got a completely free hand in selecting people or inviting people to participate in the conference. As far as I can recall, there was no political slant of any kind. I invited the most distinguished academics I knew of who had written in the area, Ronald Coase, for example. He was from the University of Chicago, but that's not really a terrible condemnation in academic circles. So, you know, it's true, and as Ellie suggested, it has to be true that any White House office has to report to the president and has to do what the president wants. But the general tenor of OTP's behavior and policy positions during the period I was there was that we had a pretty good grasp of what sensible policy would be, and we were dealing with two entities, both of whom were in different ways completely irrational. One was the White House, and the other was the FCC. And our job was to do the best we could to set things on a better path. So that was the reason for the initial conference, and it was the reason for most of what OTP did, at least during the period that I was there. And I'm sure Steve Wildman can back me up on that. The thing that's astonishing, and I'll stop after this, is that I still feel that the FCC isn't doing the right thing, even though there are now dozens of economists employed by the Commission and other very bright and well-informed people, and even though this conference exists and has existed on and off for 40 years, and I'm still trying to figure out why that's true. My latest theory, and get ready to see it next year sometime when my book is published, My latest theory is that it's a form of corruption.
Why don't we have Dale make a comment or two, and then we'll start to move down with some reflections.
Is that on now? Okay. Yeah, I of course came with Tom, connect with Tom because of the open skies issue, where I mean, let me back up. The environment at this time was so anti-competition that I think a lot of us were really trying to look at ways of trying to open things up, and partly it was political in the sense that you want some people who can do the analysis and so forth if you believe, as many of us did, that this country is based upon a competitive market. So in that sense, I think it was political, reaching out to academics, and to my own version of getting involved was the issue of whether we should have competition in domestic satellites or not. And the people who were opposed to that, who wanted essentially ComStat, as I recall, to have a monopoly, argued that there wasn't enough parking spots out there in the orbit to accommodate competition. Well, I was an engineer, I'd never done any policy work, but I got involved in that, and that, you know, that really intrigued me. And I think the same thing applies on the economic side too. At the same time, what opened my eyes was the economists would say, well, the local network may be a natural monopoly, but the long distance market isn't. It was definitely could be competitive if you look at the economies of scale. And likewise, the CPE, there was no reason for that to have to be tied to and part of the monopoly. And it was the economists then that began, even at this conference, that began, I thought, challenging that sort of thing. And that to me was a lot of the motivation for the academic economy provide a certain amount of cover for what I consider to be the right sort of policy solution. That was opening things up. So that's what intrigued me, as having, because we were terribly outmanned. It's politically incorrect. We were outnumbered. We were drastically outnumbered during that period, and we sure welcomed the academics taking a look at and doing some analysis. And let me just say one more thing too: that an economic analysis is still so important. And what troubles me today is I see an awful lot of it is sort of sponsored research by advocates. And I think one of the real values of here was having more academic, where you get a bit more peer review and things like that, a little more challenges to the academic work. So I think that's another good motivation. In fact, I kind of, some ways, see more return to those roots of having more academic review, if you will, of papers that are submitted in support of policy positions.
Let me suggest maybe that Bill Melody make a comment now, since he looked interested in coming in at this point.
Yeah, thanks very much. I was on the demand side of TPRC's creation. The FCC in the early 1960s did not have any economists. They had a lot of lawyers, they had a lot of engineers, a lot of accountants, a lot of administrators. And they were regulating the AT&T monopoly with a method of regulation called continuing surveillance. And what that was advertised as is, you don't have these public cases and evidence and studies. You cooperate, you negotiate, you meet on a continuing basis, and that's where you get the best results. And so they decided they needed some economics help, and they hired Harry Trebbing to establish a small economics office. And I was one of the young, brand new PhDs that he hired to join this office. And we began our review of AT&T's performance in a whole variety of areas. And one of the areas that we looked at was a case that was brought to the FCC involving something called a Carter phone. And the Carter phone was a terminal device that was not an electrical connection to the network, but a cradle. You took one phone in and put it this way, the other phone this way, and then the communication could take place without an electrical connection. But the FCC was ready to deny this as an illegal foreign attachment. Well, I grew up in Canada. I thought foreigners were people from different countries. But I quickly learned foreign meant not owned by AT&T. And so the commission was ready to reject this on the basis of AT&T's totally ridiculous evidence. So in the economics office, I was the one assigned to write a little paper to show them that there's no reason to not to allow this to go ahead. And then back came, this is the foot in the door. You let them have this one, who knows what they'll ask for next. So this turned out to be a raging debate. And I almost hate to support Bruce on this, but at the time we found out that 5 or 6 economists were arguing in favor, and the entire commission was arguing against. And it turned out to be a major battle. The only reason we got this through the commission was because this problem had been referred by a court. That Carter had basically tried to get regulatory approvals from the state and the federal regulator. They had basically been told, go away, we won't even think about it. And so Carter went to court and tried to bring an antitrust suit against AT&T. And the court said, well, before we can make a decision, we need to know what the FCC's policy is on interconnection. And very quickly, the FCC realized its policy was to do whatever AT&T asked them to do. And so as a result of this, the FCC had to deal with the problem and finally agreed to allow the Carter phone. And as you will know, those of you who read the books, this was the beginning of the liberalization movement in telecommunication. Then MCI made an application for a private microwave system between Chicago and St. Louis, 11 microwave towers. With this one, all hell broke loose. This was a fundamental challenge to the common carrier principle. And everyone knows this is a natural monopoly. Economies of scale run down forever. And if you upset that, the whole thing could unravel. So this turned out to be another major battle. And in this particular case, we managed to get the commission in the end to vote 4-3 to allow MCI under very restricted conditions. At the same time, we had been doing research on computers. We could see from the technical literature that computer communication was possible. And what was interesting is our major research source for this was Bell Laboratory Publications. They were at the frontier of the technical development. What had never occurred to them is it wasn't necessary for them to own it all. And so we began to look seriously at, all right, how far does the natural monopoly go if you accept this argument? And after the survey, it showed. It included the physical facilities. It included all the services that went over them. It included every terminal device was attached to the network. It included all the equipment in the network. It included the phone books. It included covers on the phone books. And we thought, well, this is patently ridiculous. We have to do something about it. But by this time in the late 1960s, what we found was that AT&T was marshaling its opposition. We had Bell Labs experts coming down daily to give lectures to the commission on how we were misguided, and the monopoly had to stay the way it was. Famous consulting firms, famous economists from leading universities came in to explain that even though my textbook that you studied for your PhD, Melody, says competition is good, what you have to understand is there are exceptions. And this is a natural monopoly, this is the exceptions. So we were going nowhere. And I remember thinking, our time here may be known for the fact of getting one terminal device approved and 11 microwave towers. So we decided, what are we going to do? We started to look around and look for kindred spirits in Washington. And one of the first we found was Richard Gable. Some of you old timers will remember Richard. He was a gem because he had all the history and he had enormous piles of data. He too was working in an agency that basically totally ignored him. In fact, they spent most of their time lending him to other agencies, I think, to get him out of the way. And in those travels, that's where we ran into Bruce. And I remember we would have very informal discussions over lunch or an afternoon for an hour at the end of the day on what can be done about cracking the monopoly. The argument was simply to get rid of the ridiculous opposition to anything. We were quite happy to go with the evidence, but the evidence, we needed independent evidence. So it was in that case that we finally met Bruce, that Bruce then, as he has indicated, then began to move the ball to create a community where there really wasn't one before. And finally, I must tell you this story. One of the good sources of statistical information is the OECD Communications Outlook. It comes out every 2 years. That's mostly statistics in there about developments in telecommunication in all the OECD countries. In looking at this issue, I was reminded of something I've forgotten about entirely, where they say in reviewing their history, in 1969, William Melody, an economist at the US FCC, suggested at an OECD meeting that countries introduce competition to increase market efficiency, with little support around the table. The US representative from the Department of Commerce made a speech and told them that I definitely did not represent the US policy in any way, shape, or form. And I remember the reason I got my first trip to Paris was because OECD had heard about Carterphone, and they knew a little about MCI and the computer inquiry, and then they said to the FCC, send a senior official to tell us about the new policy. Well, since there was no new policy, the top brass of the FCC said, we're not going, we're not going, we're not going. Finally, it was sent down to Harry Trebbing, the chief of the economics office. They said, you go. And Harry said, I'm not going, I don't fly. So he said to me, you know, you've been pushing this stuff the hardest, you go. And before I went, I spoke to at least 6 senior officials, all of whom told me I better watch what I was going to say, and I must be sure to put in the disclaimer that my views did not represent anyone, anywhere except me. So that was the trip to Paris. I was seriously concerned that this whole effort was going to abort. Because I don't have time to regale you with all the stories about what AT&T was doing at the time. But clearly the forces were indicating that they were quite capable of stopping this in its tracks. And that's what, from my perspective, and those of us at the FCC who were trying to bring about change, how we saw it. And to that extent, Bruce and TPRC was our avenue of rescue. It was where some forces may be marshaled with evidence that would be paid attention to. I found it particularly curious that as an FCC staff member doing research, that my research was biased because I worked for the FCC. The view that AT&T had successfully sold the FCC, that the work by our own staff is considered unbiased, and unbiased research had to be somebody who wasn't at AT&T and who wasn't at the FCC. And TPRC provided that. And that was the real demand that drove this picture.
Well, let's turn it over to Marjorie in the context of, I've learned one thing, which is where that disclaimer comes from that anybody who's ever worked at the FCC has to say it anytime they speak in public. But also, we see TPRC being a community that helped build the intellectual framework for policy change. And maybe as Marjorie starts to reflect, and then we'll move to Donna and Jorge, maybe we can reflect about how that evolved in subsequent years with TPRC.
Well, we definitely have to, because I truly was a kid 40 years ago when TPRC got started. So I want to fast forward to when I first started getting involved, which was probably about 1990. And before I came here, I started thinking about that period, but I also want to add in some of my reflections on what I've been observing, sort of comparing sort of then and now. So at that time, I was running the Computer Science and Telecommunications Board at the National Academies, and my challenge was to try to bridge telecommunications policy with the emerging internet policy. And people like Henry Geller and Roger Knoll said, well, you have to go to TPRC, even though they waned in their own attendance. So among my contributions in that period was one that really sort of echoes in my mind at this meeting, which was that I organized a panel in 1995 when I realized that by and large the TPRC mainstays did not understand the internet. So I had Dave Clark and some of his friends and some others who were actually here and some who were not, pairing up internet techies and people who understood telecom policy, economics, and so on, to talk about a set of issues. And the papers from that panel were published in 1996 in Telecommunications Policy. So if I look from that moment, which was the first time that there was an internet techie here, to today, there's a huge amount of change. Just sitting in the last panel that I was in, which was on security, and listening not only to the presentations, but to the kinds of questions that were asked. The participation, the attendance is obviously a lot different. So we've come a long way. Now, part of what I was hearing about this early history and engaging economics involved taking what I think people thought was a high quality level of economics in the academic community and trying to integrate it into the Washington community. I will say as an observer that what then happened, in the later 90s into the beginning of the turn of the century was a bit of a struggle in the academic community to try to get its head around internet policy. So I think if we're honest, we have to say quality was not always the word that applied to some of those discussions. But we were watching the evolution of an intellectual community, and again, looking at where we are now. A lot has happened, there's a lot of maturity, and as Ellie was saying last night, we've moved around from domination by economists and lawyers to a broader range of disciplines that chew on these topics. Part of what we were just hearing was that there was a lot of concern about educating government by drawing on scholars, informing policy. I do think it's an open question whether that is still the role of TPRC today. So again, if I think in my time, there's been waxing and waning in the participation of people from federal agencies. So there are some people from the FCC who will point out that there's waxing and waning in their ability to even publish a paper or to present at a conference, let alone is their budget to attend a conference. So over time, we've moved from more remote locations to be here, and it's very accessible, and people don't need to spend money to come here. It's on a weekend, it's easy. But my sense is that more of the value of what happens at TPRC is in nurturing this scholarly community, and not necessarily in directly counseling and advising the policy community, which I think is hard in a period when a lot of us are experiencing conference and workshop fatigue. But we come here to meet with each other, to talk with each other, and to inform whoever wants to be informed by that discourse. I did serve on the board from 2000 to 2005. The praise for today's board, Johannes et al., is richly deserved. I will observe that that period was probably the nadir. But we can take credit for the Veranders being part of our new leadership. That was actually a very difficult transition, which I think even Jorge may remember. But obviously we've come out of it on the right side. And we also made a number of changes in the business model. And the fact that it has lasted, that people would pay more often than they used to pay, was a good thing, and was a testament to the loyalty of the community and the willingness for it to persevere. So I could say more, but in the interest of time, I'm going to pass it on to Donna. Oh, she has one.
Thank you very much. When I first got asked to do this, I thought I was the token young person, but clearly that's Marjorie. So I don't have 40 years, but I have 30-something years. So I think I was the token second wave. So after the economists, they got through with the economists, then they moved on to us lawyers. And it's very interesting to watch today. I was looking at the Twitter feed going, and somebody tweeted that only 1/3 of the people here are experts and the rest are tobacco institute types. So that must be you guys. I'm pretty sure I'm substantive. But just to go back to the 1972, I wasn't a girl, but I wasn't a lawyer yet either. But to give some sense of what was going on in 1972, and Ellie gave a good sense, but of course that was the year that the Watergate break-ins happened, and Gates not Bill Gates, but became known for scandal. But it was also the year that the game Pong was introduced. It was when HBO was launched. It was a calculator, a very basic calculator that just did basic math functions, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, cost $100 at that point. And I remember studying, and there was a question of whether or not there was a calculator divide between those of us who had to use slide rules because we couldn't afford the $100. And it's a very different time. But then I also think the more things change, the more they remain the same, because what was TPRC talking about? Market power, information access, pricing, spectrum, and what do we talk about here today? Those same things. So it's quite an evolution, and it's really wonderful to have this be more than kind of just U.S. policy and getting a lot of information. But I think the core purpose of TPRC remains, which is to get independent data. And those of us who work kind of, we'll call them the trenches. We are able to get expert economists and sometimes engineers and lawyers and so forth to speak to it. But it's a real benefit to everybody to have the independent data, and I think that's the value that TPRC provides. And anyone who looks at innovation and idea innovation, has found, and consistent with the natural theories of evolution, that the evolution and the evolution in ideas comes at the edges, and I think TPRC is really the place to bring the edges. Back in I did a little research and talked to some oldsters before I came here, and I was reminded that the first economist who said Pareto optimality, we got $1. And now I know we should get $20 to hear wild cluster bootstrap tea. I have no idea what it means, but next year, the next time someone says that you get $20 off the bat. Pardon? And the only other observation I want to make right now is that I think I forgot, it was maybe Bruce who said it, that there were some really luminaries in the first meetings. Justice Scalia, Brian Lamb. Now, they clearly went on to better things, and some of us are still sitting here. So, for whatever that's worth.
Thanks, Donna. It's probably a good idea to remind those of you who weren't here that when the conference started out, it was invitation only. It was, after its birthing, held at a little place out in Virginia called Airlie House, which was not a very big place, and I think it accommodated a maximum of about 50 people, was about what it accommodated. And the money came from just generous donations from the Markle Foundation, from the FCC, from OTP, from various sources. The organizing committees or program committees, there was only one. It did everything, and as well as appoint its own successors, and came up with whatever was going to be discussed. But by the middle of the 1980s, the model was falling apart. The government had pulled out substantially, and then sometime in the 1990s, Markle pulled out. And when Markle pulled out, the bottom fell out. Those of us who happened to be on the planning committee and the board at the time had to figure out what were we going to do if we were going to try to maintain this model. It was suggested at the time that we form an association like academic associations do, and have this association have graduate students and academics come. And a number of people said, if we do that, we're going to start having paper sessions just so people can have paper sessions on their resumes that they came, and get graduate students to come, and that's not what this conference is about at all. So there was a genuine crossroads. The crossroads was resolved when a couple of us, Richard Taylor, myself, a few others, went to talk to the Ford Foundation, and the person at the Ford Foundation who we thought would be the most sympathetic to the idea, and that was Gigi Sohn, who's here. Gigi Sohn, in a very real way, probably more than any other single individual, saved the conference. The conference was able to continue because she put a good deal of money up to get the conference going for that year. And at the end of the conversation, she said, I want you guys to understand one thing. We said, okay, well, what is it, Gigi? You've already said you're going to give us the money. She said, I'm not going to keep doing this because I can't. And so that started what Marjorie mentioned, was thinking about other models. The conference also went to a lot of different places. It was at Airlie House, and it went to Skytop Lodge in the Poconos, for those of you who remembers Skytop Lodge in the Poconos. Well, at that conference, Heather Hudson organized a panel on telecommunications needs in case of nuclear disasters. And that panel was the only, I know she's saying no, that panel, but she's old. That panel was the only panel in the history of the conference that nobody attended. But it was on the same day as 3 Mile Island. So we don't always get it right. Hey. The other thing about the conference and then we went to Annapolis, we went to the Eastern Shore, the crab part of the Eastern Shore we went to. I mean, there would be this meal, mountains of crabs people would eat. There'd be a table for Rob Frieden all by himself with his big mountain of crabs. And then we moved around to various places in Virginia before we got here. So the story is one of individuals who didn't have to, working real hard to maintain a discourse. And that, for me, was my other lesson about this is I had been trained, as a lot of us have, to think of policy as a series of discrete problems that are solved. But in fact, my lesson was that policy is really a long, ongoing discourse. And there are moments when decisions are made, moments when decisions aren't made, but a kind of discussion takes place over a long period of time, and our opportunity is to help shape that discussion to an extent. And in the process, what the conference did was create a community, a very real community that, for me, has been absolutely crucial to my entire career. So one last story. I first came to the conference in 1977. I was fresh out of graduate school. I was still in my 20s. These people were kind of scary. I didn't have very many conference experiences. And I'm not even sure how I got invited, since it was invited only, except that I was probably really young and I knew somebody. So my first concrete memory of the conference is walking from the building where the little rooms were where you stayed, up to the big house where the panels were held at Airlie House. And I'm nervous, and I've got the first briefcase I ever bought, I'm holding it, I've got all my papers in there, everything ready, and these two guys come walking down the other direction, and I'm looking at them with my glasses, and I'm thinking, holy shit, it's Henry Geller and Herb Dordick. And I've never met these guys, but I know who they are. It's Henry Geller and Herb Dordick are coming this way. Sort of dress yourself up, Henry Geller, and they're coming. And then I realized they're both dressed in tennis clothes. The conference is beginning, right? I'm heading up for the conference. They're dressed in tennis clothes, and they're coming this way. And Herb is first, and Herb has 2 tennis rackets under his arm and a bag full of balls. And as they walk by, Herb waves the tennis rackets and says, "Great conference, great issues," and walks the other way. So my immediate thought was, okay, these are my kind of people. I can do this conference. So the last thing, about 40 years in my mind, is this has been a great conference to meet people for me. Met all kinds of really important people. But sometime, and I crossed the line, and I don't remember when I crossed it, but I began to say goodbye. So for those of you who know, Herb Dordick's not around anymore. And for those of you who knew Herb, he was an important figure. I miss him. 2 people who were instrumental in this conference for years both died this year. Mayor Ru Josawala and Yale Brownstein. And so one of the evolutions of a discourse in a community over time is you go from saying hello to saying goodbye. And that saying goodbye is a sign of maturity. Hopefully this community will be around for a long time. There'll be a lot of hellos and a lot of goodbyes. Thank you.
So I just want to add that for a lot of you who know me know that Henry Geller was my mentor, and he's the one who introduced me to TPRC. And I was talking to him actually yesterday, and I was asking him to reminisce about TPRC, and he said, oh, I was economists, we didn't know what they were talking about. He said, but the papers looked really interesting, and I'd get the big stack, and I'd flip through them, and he'd be like, bullshit, 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 bullshit. And he's still around, he's doing great, and he is one of the true geniuses in telecommunications policy, and he's responsible not just for myself being in this field, but I think for a lot of us here. If you have the opportunity, please feel free to give him a line and express your appreciation, because it's far better to do it now when he's still here.
A note on Henry Geller. When I was engaged in our battles at the FCC to get the policy change, it was basically the economists saying, let the new entrants in, the engineers saying, no, technological determinism. You heard a lot about that last night. So you shouldn't let them in. We had the lawyers saying they were the ultimate killers. After we knocked down the technical resistance, the lawyers would say, all very nice, but it's illegal. You have to change the law if you want to do what you're doing. Finally, Henry Geller was made general counsel at the FCC. And if it hadn't been for Henry, these decisions wouldn't have been passed. Then after that, as most people know, he's been instrumental in TPRC for many years.
And then I think we would welcome questions from the audience as well as more observations from the panel, but Ellie, please.
So now the question is, with technology changing all around us, how does it affect the technology of TPRC, the structure, the format? It used to be that we came here because that was the main way to be a community and to connect and to get the information before it gets published 2 or 3 years later. But that's not true anymore. We have other ways. And so the question now is, do we want to continue the same model, or is there another way? I find that the actual exchange of information, the papers themselves, are perhaps less important because one can get them in so many other ways, probably better and more effectively, and can read them in better ways. So, seems to me, however, that the discussion, the common denominator, the community part of this, beyond the chatting over drinks and food and so on, is really kind of at the center of what this event is. And therefore, I think that, to me, kind of the greatest things are if we came to discuss, not just as a panels, but as kind of a plenaries, are perhaps more important than individual sessions. Individual sessions are still important, but here I would suggest that perhaps we have to move also to internet speed. I think these sessions, the presentations are very good, but maybe they take too much time. Our attention span, for better or worse, is kind of narrowed. And so the TED-type format of kind of a very focused, concentrated way might be the way to go. Still the same number of papers, shorter, and more plenaries.
Yeah, that was exactly the point that I was going to make, that we ought to consider more of the 10-minute format, but there also might be, at least for certain subgroups, sort of the equivalent of research speed dating. You know, there may be different ways to group people, to structure some of the interactions that aren't merely, you know, stand and deliver and then Q&A, but just different forms of taking advantage of the fact that people like to be in the same space at the same time.
Great idea for the board to take forward.
And you know, one of the panels I was in today, they mentioned, why aren't we videoing this? And I think that's just a fabulous idea. I mean, these days, there's no real incremental cost to video, and you could put it up, and people could do real-time questions, people who can't come to Washington, and it's something really that would be very worthwhile, and open this up to a greater audience. So I think it would be something certainly to consider for the future.
I'm happy to entertain questions. I'm happy to entertain more comments, and I hope some reflections about maybe ways in which TPRC as a community has helped inform policymakers since those early days of breaking up the monopoly. I welcome that.
In the early period, TPRC was plowing new ground. We knew very clearly what the issues were, and there was a very strong focus on addressing those issues. The United States was the first country to introduce the telecom reform process. In my own career, I was chased out of the FCC by 1971, and after spending time at the University of Pennsylvania and then some other universities, I was assisting the Justice Department in the antitrust case because AT&T was engaging in anti-competitive practices against virtually all the competitors during the 1970s. And so after the '84 divestiture of AT&T, I figured these problems have all been solved in America, so I can move on to other countries. And TPRC will probably expire because there's nothing left to do. Naivete can last a long time with some of us. But working in other countries, I have helped establish the European CPR, Communication Policy Research Conference. Interestingly, they didn't adopt the T, they adopted the C because this was late 1980s, that it was already apparent that telecommunication was now more than telecommunication. And so we needed to start looking, not consider just the traditional telecom issues. I then moved on and have helped establish what is, many of you will know, as CPR South, first in Asia, then in Africa. They just had their first joint meeting in Mauritius. And what's interesting about these other associations is each has responded to the unique conditions in their country or countries. And their major role has been far less address a specific policy issue and far more educate and train and build a community of people who are capable of engaging on these policy issues. So it's a combination of policy research and policy education. But what is particularly interesting is, as they have pursued their agenda, I think they are pursuing practices that TPRC would do well to pay some attention to. Both Rahan Samarajiwa and Alison Gilwald are here from the Asian and African networks if you want to discuss that with them. That also relates to the fact that I think TPRC has to go global. So far, TPRC has been national, and foreigners have come to learn. And that was good during the early period, because the US was at least a decade ahead. But things have moved along quite rapidly now. So right now, if you think about what regions of the world are ahead in various aspects of development of this broader field. Well, when I think of the US, where is the US clearly ahead? Well, you think of Intug, Microsoft, Google, Apple, that era, Facebook. You'll say, well, none of those are telecommunication companies. None of those are really under the jurisdiction of telecommunication. So that's where the US is pioneering. Then we ask, well, all right, who's pioneering in mobile? Well, Europe was for a while. Now it's Asia. Who's pioneering in broadband? Denmark, Europe. The question then, and who is pioneering on applications? The FCC or the OECD says the big push now is on applications in other sectors, right? Transport, electricity, health, learning, et cetera. You know, finally, SURF is no longer going to be able to say 99% of the applications have yet to be invented. We're moving ahead on applications. Well, from my experience, if you want to really look and see where the frontier of applications is, you better go to developing countries. If you have no communication and you have no banking, you're going to be the first customer for M-banking. So we find M-banking being pioneered in Africa. We ask universal service, the big issue in broadband. Where's greatest developments in universal service? Well, why don't you try the bottom of the pyramid in Asia, where you have the lowest rates, all kinds of pioneering new ways of applications that I think would have applicability here. So I think the way things have evolved, now this future development is much more of a global exchange of information. And it would be a mistake, I think, to keep TPRC focused primarily on US issues. Thanks.
I know we've tried in recent years to reach out to international, but let's get the audience involved with this question, followed by one over here.
Well, thank you, Bill, for a wonderful segue into what I was about to say, because my question was somewhat rhetorical to the group here, but do you actually realise how much of an influence TPRC has actually had on policy in other countries? Because when I first started researching what was happening in New Zealand around 1999-2000, I came to realise that an awful lot of the policy activity that had gone on in New Zealand had been informed by a number of the very same people who had come here and presented papers at TPRC. And once I started researching into this area and following the bona fides of the papers and making contact with these people and started coming myself, I started actually meeting with the people who've been here discussing those issues. And I think it's a tribute to the power of TPRC, how many of the people and the papers that have been part of your forum have contributed to the discourse in New Zealand. At times, I think there might have been some feelings from some of New Zealand that maybe some of these American academics and policymakers was treating New Zealand as this little experiment place where they could come and try things that weren't quite the same way as in the United States. But that's been good because we've learned from the process too. And New Zealand owes TPRC a debt, and hopefully I'm starting to pay that back. But I would like you to comment on whether you are aware of other instances of where the papers and the discussions have influenced in other countries without even necessarily being there, because the members and the advocates have gone out and done the work of spreading the news of what goes on here.
Any comments?
Well, this is probably going to run counter to what you just said, but there was one year that I was corralled by I won't name the country, but they were very, very interested in our system, our LADA system, and they were going to try to set up their entire telephone system with LADAs and everything else, and all I could do is say, no, no, don't do this. This is a bad idea, but they were so infatuated with the American system of competition that they really wanted to copy everything that we put together, so that probably runs counter to what you just said.
Mike Nelson, Bloomberg Government. I had the privilege of being on the board for almost 10 years in the 90s and got off about 7 or 8 years ago. And we did go through a really interesting transition there. In just a couple of years, we had to move where we held this meeting, we had to get a new business model, we had to get a new management. And at the same time, we were also thinking about changing the name. Because at the time, suddenly the internet was there and we understood that we had to be looking at that. So we looked at, Digital Policy Research Committee Conference, or, Telecommunications and Internet Research Committee Conference. In the end, it was too radical a change. We changed everything else, but we didn't change the name. But it is great to see how broad we've gotten. But I think there's a worry that I have at that we are getting too broad. The strength here is that we have these synergies between the different pieces of digital policy. But that's also a danger, because now that there are these specialized workshops and conferences, if you really care about spectrum auctions, you can probably go spend 3 days living and breathing spectrum auctions. If you really care about online privacy, you've got 10 conferences to choose from. So we're going to have to make very sure we keep doing something unique here, and that we look for the synergies between those different facets, and that this doesn't become just an umbrella organization where there's 4 or 5 different sub-conferences. So I like the idea of the plenary sessions, so everyone will be exposed to things outside their comfort zone. But I also think we should think one more time about changing the name. The other thing we thought about changing was the C, from conference to community. And I think we should think more about being a 12-month-a-year community. And just to throw a straw man out there, why not twice a month do a conference call in one of the different specialties, let people hear about some of the cool things that are going on, just simple conference call, 1 hour. Not everybody will join in any given session, but it's a great way to kind of keep the drumbeat going, to have people throwing ideas around about who might be a good keynote speaker, about what great speakers we need. It would probably help the program committee, although they might end up getting even more applications. But I think that's one way to keep the community alive, and also avoid this problem of sort of splintering. I saw this happen with the Internet Society. I was very involved in the INET conferences in the 90s. And when it started, it was the only place to go if you cared about Internet standards, Internet policy, Internet technology. But by the end of the 90s, there were 50 different specialized conferences, and it lost its meaning. So we have to make sure we don't let that happen. Just a precautionary tale.
Great. Marjorie has a comment, and then
So I
Then
think
Dave
that point
Waterman.
is well taken. One of the observations I had is that, and Jorge knows this, that TPRC has never done all that well with information security issues. They touch on it from time to time. I think Jorge and I were involved with one panel that definitely didn't go very well, but mostly because people weren't interested in issues that took a hard look at national security. And even in today's security panel, so-called, it was very clear there was a bias in the room that, you know, law enforcement, we don't trust them. So it's not a really balanced discussion. Meanwhile, there are at least some people here who've been involved with a workshop on the economics of information security. That is just now 10 years old. You go to those conferences, you see the same kind of evolution of a community, the immaturity, the sort of oscillation among alternatives. This is all by way of saying that I think there's some kind of mechanism. I don't know what it is, but there's a mechanism by which you can keep the core and also make sure that you expose the core to peripheral issues that people really ought to know about, so that they know enough about what they're saying. And it may be worthwhile for the board or the program committee or somebody to think about what those mechanisms are, so that you can build them in the main event as well as possibly the auxiliary events.
I mean, those are great suggestions. Dave Waterman with a question and comment.
Thanks. Yeah, David Waterman from Indiana University, and I want to follow up on Bill Nelson's comment, which is that there are a lot of specialized conferences, and I've been coming here a number of years, and I do, my work is almost entirely about the economics of media, and there's usually only a couple of sessions or sometimes one about the economics of media. And I've been to the specialized conferences. There's several on media economics that happen, but I learn more here. And I think that by going around to the different sessions about communications and telecommunications and internet more generally, it really helps me a great deal to understand the media. So I feel that is a very important thing. So I really value the diversity of the conference, and I just wanted to make that that comment. I would add one thing that that I had thought about, which is, and you talked about the idea of community. I thought maybe that a good transition from you know, having the annual conference might be more of a formal organization. You know, there's the International Telecommunications Society in Europe, and there seems to be an opportunity for having an organization that might grow out of this conference or develop from it, in which there would be membership, and this might provide an infrastructure for more specialized activities like that, including the conference.
Heather Hudson, I believe, had a comment. This is absolutely wonderful input for those of us still on the board. And as the mic goes towards Heather, could I just get a show of hands for people who have in the past been involved on the board or program committee who are here? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've a couple comments and a question. First, a disclaimer. Jorge, I was not at the conference in the Poconos, let alone organizing a session such as you described.
I'm old too.
But I will say that there are people who were very influential early on, and Herb Bardick was one. I was in a similar situation to Jorge, working in Washington, hearing about this conference, thinking it sounded wonderful, but it was only by invitation, And Herb Dordick said, just come. So I crashed it the first time. And it was a wonderful experience, and the next year I found myself on a program committee, so you never know. But I think that several of the comments are very well taken. I think some things we have done well, many things, but the relationships with journals so that there are ways to get papers published. We used to do, in some cases, a hard copy proceedings, and that's kind of a dated thing to do anyway these days, but I think for researchers, you know, getting an opportunity to be considered for a journal is a useful thing to do. There may be other journals or other ways to do that, but that's been worthwhile. We have tried to internationalize. We should do more, but it's wonderful to hear from Bronwyn about that. I like the idea of plenaries or coming back to some kind of thematic overview, maybe with a panel that we all get to hear about something that we should be aware of or that's really cutting edge. So I think that would be worth considering. The one thing I would like to ask the government people who are here, because one of the reasons it was held, as several of you said, in Washington, or it was supposed to be close enough to Washington so people from the federal government could come, but not close enough that they could run back to their desks in between sessions. So now it's on weekends, so they have to be persuaded that it's worth taking time to do that. But I would be interested in knowing from government people who are here but not represented, is this still useful for you? How do we make it perhaps more useful? Is there a way to get congressional staffers or more international? We used to have World Bank participation, other development people. Are there other ways to make it relevant to the other communities that are based in Washington? And I completely agree that the networking among people here is really what makes it worth coming together, although I think there are many good ideas about what we could do in addition or in between. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions or comments from the panelists?
Any other federal government person?
Barbara Cherry.
Oh, Barbara Cherry, I think. We're about...
Tell her to raise her hand so they can see her.
We're a question or two away from adjourning to our party, where we can continue this kind of discussion. So Barbara?
Yes, Barb Cherry. I just wanted to echo some of my colleagues' comments, and I wanted to stress that in addition to the diversity of the subject matter, to echo also concerns raised by Heather, the diversity of the kinds of institutions that people come from. One thing I found challenging in my own career is I had been in industry, then academia, and then government, and there aren't many places you can go where you can get people with all three types of background, you know, people from these different three kinds of institutions to be able to share research with each other. Because any given forum that's exclusively one becomes very insular in their thinking and their way of framing issues. And so I think it's very important to make sure that, as Heather was mentioning, make sure that we're still relevant and of interest to people who come from these various groups, because I found from my own personal experience, even though I've been in telecom since 1983 now, every time I worked for a different institution, the issues look differently, because the institution you work for presses upon you different understandings of what their incentives are or what their pressures are for how they look at issues. And as we develop policymaking, we need to have a mutual understanding better of all these differing views. And to me, networking here has been an important part of that. And then I wanted to also echo with ITS. I've been thrilled to see more of my ITS colleagues coming here, because there's also danger we can become too US-centric. And so it's a really difficult, delicate, but such a vital thing to keep this kind of diversity in all these different domains, not just subject matter, but institutional diversity. So I just wanted to echo that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Do we have additional? Oh, Prabir.
I'd just like to take up that point of US centricity, which was made by Bill Melody and Barbara. Speaking as a Canadian, and I've attended the last 20 conferences, I was at Poconos, and I served on the program committee for 6 years. It seems to me that those of us who are not from the US somehow get this feeling that the conference still remains US-centric, and that there is a reluctance perhaps to admit that there are lessons to be learned from other jurisdictions. I don't know if this is a biased feeling or not. I accept that there must be certain core areas and areas of focus, but perhaps this is something that should be considered going forward, because as was said before me, if you want to look at mobile communications, where's the action? It's in Asia. If you want to look at widespread development of fiber, where is it? It's in Australia and Europe. Seems to me that we are only interested in focusing on US developments and giving advice to the US policy-making community.
Just a response. I consider Prabir one of my favorite colleagues that comes to this, but I'm going to disagree a little bit and suggest that one of the unintended consequences of going to a system of having folks pay to come was that it opened it up in ways that we hadn't anticipated, and that in fact the conference has evolved to have much more of an international participation. And as several people have said, it's what happens out here in the conversations that are very important. And for me, I'm delighted Prabir's still coming, because we always have great conversations together. But the point is, those conversations travel. They go back to where people came from, and those ideas then get exchanged. And that's the invisible part of the value of what this conference provides.
In my panel, there were 7 panelists, only one of whom was from the US. I'm not saying it can't be done. All I'm saying is that's probably not the way most panels are structured.
Marjorie has a comment, and as I look around, we may be giving Marjorie the last word. I'm not sure.
Well, I would just say that the international engagement issue should be another one for the list of thoughts about alternative mechanisms. Just in my observation, we have a few people from other countries. They participate in panels in the same way. People may not be as interested if they're Americentric in their thinking, but I don't think we take advantage enough of people who come from other parts of the world, and there might be something other than a traditional panel session that would foster exchange better.
I mean, I will observe, as somebody who's been on the board for, I think, 6 or 8 years, and the program committee prior to that, at any number of points along the way in our discussions at the board level, we are always asking about outreach to international. We count. We count how many papers we're getting. We notice if we get fewer one year than in the prior year. And then it's up to the program committee, of course, to integrate those papers into the sessions. And I think I think it's very helpful to have a panel such as Prabir's on international comparisons. If we only did that, I think that would be silly. We don't. We integrate international papers topically where they belong. We're always trying to do better in that regard, and I think we're going to, at the board level, certainly continue to try. I did see one additional question, and it will be the last word. And
Chris Marsden from Essex. I first came in '98, and the thrill for me of coming to TPRC was to be in a place where I saw US policymakers talking to researchers. So, I don't want this conference to be, we have conferences in other parts of the world where we can go to conferences and be very international, which is great. But I think at the moment the balance is about 2/3, 1/3, maybe slightly more than 2/3, 1/3 international versus US papers. I don't see that that's terribly wrong. The debate about 3 versus 4 papers per panel I know has been going on for a long time, and maybe we could have more 4 and less 3. But this is the 40th anniversary celebration for TPRC. Something must be going right.
Thank you, Chris, for a very wonderful last word. I think things have been going right, and right now things are going down the hall that way to the celebratory party.
To the right.
To the right. And we are adjourned, and we can continue this conversation over drinks in that direction to the right. So thank you very much, panelists. If we can recognize our distinguished panelists. Thank you.